podcast of the Emergency Podcast System. Had this been a real podcast, you would leave edified and entertained.
Welcome back to the Emergency Podcast System. I'm your host, Pete Cantillon. We talk about pretty much whatever I want, so you're never going to get really a stream of themes and things like that. Every week will be a bit of a surprise. Thanks for listening. Today I just want to talk a bit about myself. Not a surprise for some people who know me, but just some background. I think it's helpful to know where a person is coming from, a bit of their journey. When I was in university, I went to Carleton University, got an English degree. And one of the things we were taught, I firmly believe it, it's important to understand the life and times of the author if you're reading a novel or poetry, because it informs your reading and it helps you to better understand where they're coming from. So in this instance, as the creator of the podcast, just a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Guelph, Ontario in 1968. It's a small southwestern Ontario town, about an hour-ish west of Toronto. A lot of rolling hills, hot summers and thunderstorms and those kinds of memories. Now, I recognize at 54 years old that, the times that I grew up in, there was actually some history going on. It is a little weird to say because history is happening every day. But I don't recollect anything of significance for the most part growing up. I mean, I didn't really watch much TV. I grew up the child of a single mother on welfare. I have 3 sisters that I grew up with, and those are my memories. I mean, those are the people that were around me. We didn't really play much together. I was a bit of a loner. So from kindergarten on, I made my own way to school. We didn't own a car. And this is not to evoke anything other than to give you a sense for my history. Now, I have a really interesting kind of blend of trauma and non-trauma growing up. So I have great memories of being on my own, biking, walking, generally exploring and doing my own thing. But there are also interspersed in that some pretty significant memories of trauma, some pretty horrific memories and experiences of violence and sexual abuse. We've talked about some of that briefly in the previous podcast, so I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail there. Suffice to say that my circumstances, I think, were significant in shaping who I am today. It's hard to say who I am. I'm a big fan of the Myers-Briggs test. I've done it numerous times. I always come out INFP, but on the verge of ENFP. So the I, introvert, and the E, extrovert, typically sit about 50-50, 49-51 out of 100. And so it's as I've heard called, maybe I am an ambivert, a person that kind of waffles between introvert and extrovert. There have been times when I thought that I am naturally an extrovert whose life and circumstance has shaped him to be an introvert. And there are other times where I think it's the opposite, where I'm naturally an introvert and that life and professional experience have forced me to be an extrovert. So I guess it depends on the day and how I'm feeling. We moved a lot. My mom moved whenever the rent went up or circumstances were negative, which was quite often. You just had to do that. If you had a landlord who was a bit of a predator or a creep, if you had a boyfriend or ex-husband who was beating you and you needed to find a new location to escape, at least temporarily, these were the circumstances that led to us moving constantly. I calculated at one point that I went to more than 30 schools from kindergarten to high school, primarily in my elementary and middle school years. And that has a pretty significant impact on certain foundational aspects of your education and what you're supposed to know, because every school was different. They didn't follow much of a standardized curriculum in the day. And so, that had a big impact. And of course, you can't form strong social bonds with people. And you don't learn those skills early on when you're always moving around. So I was a loner, not necessarily just by nature, but by circumstance. And some of that, a big part of that shapes who I am today. I have a really hard time forming bonds with people today, even my family members. This is something my family knows. It's not an excuse. I'm not trying to excuse some of the lack of depth I put into some of my relationships, but I do think it's important to understand where it comes from and why. And that's a big part of that. I kind of ended up being forced to have to be self-reliant in terms of relationships, and I am to this day. So all that to say, I can be a very difficult person to know, and I don't invest deeply in relationships because they've never been long-term. I grew up believing that relationships ended, that they were never really there to begin with, and so I think that just bleeds into the natural kind of instinctive responses I have to people seeking to form a deeper relationship with me. All that means is that people end up having to work a whole lot harder with me than they would normally have to work with someone, say, with a more stable background, with some foundational socialization experience. But I mean, my memories, there are a lot of good memories just being alone. Like I said, from kindergarten on, I made my own way to school. So I would walk to school and I would take my time. I'd often get there late. I'd stop along the way, especially on the way home when there was no real agenda. I would stop in one location where we lived close to downtown Guelph. I would often go from Sacred Heart, where I was attending school, down the street to Elizabeth Street, cross the street, and sit alongside the railroad tracks and pick through the shale that was slumped there, looking for fossils of one sort or another. There was always shells that you could find if you were, diligent, and I'd bring those home, and eventually they get lost. But that kind of stuff was that consumed me. In the spring on the walks home, in my boots, which I always had a milk bag on each foot, just to because the boots were never waterproof, right? And it was a weird feeling. It's cold and clammy, but not wet. I don't know if you can imagine it. And a little slippery inside the boot. But it was normal. And in the spring, walking home, watching the meltwater running along the sides of the street or through parking lots. And I'd imagine that I was a few thousand feet tall, looking down on great rivers, watching them carve their way through the earth. And these are experiences I remember. My memories, I think my earliest memory goes back to when I was about 2 or 3 years old. And I remember distinctly being in my grandparents' house on Dublin Street. They had a really nice house with a big front porch next to the synagogue there. And in the house, I was wearing my grandfather's tie. The tie dragged on the floor in front of me. I had a glass of milk and some Oreo cookies. And, that's a very, very specific memory. And it's weird what gets stuck in your mind. So, those old memories go back a good long ways. The more recent memories, sometimes I have a tough time trying to remember stuff from, in this morning, which is, it's always been that way. Even as a kid, Mom said that, I would struggle with the short-term memory stuff. I couldn't get to the store without calling her. She'd always have to give me an extra quarter to use in the payphone, because she knew I'd have to call her when I got to the store to remember what it was I was supposed to buy. And eventually she just started writing lists, even though it was only a block away, which was helpful. Going to, like I said, I went to a lot of schools growing up, lived in Guelph my entire life, with a couple of exceptions. We were in foster care for quite some time with a family in Mount Forest. My sister and I, Angel and I. My younger sister Susan was in a different family for that period of time. She was a baby. The experience was memorable, fine. They were a nice family, a big Dutch family with a hog barn, and so we'd spend time in the barn looking at the pigs and the piglets and watching how they took care of them, and they were a good group. I used to get a quarter every single night I didn't pee the bed. And I tried to explain to them I've never peed the bed, but this was just the way it was. They were convinced getting the quarter was the motivation, so that's fine. I took it. Yeah, another memory. So I went to a ton of schools. I was bullied a lot. Again, partly just, I think, when I look back on it now, I was just the new kid. I didn't have a lot of social skills. It was hard for me to communicate. So it makes you an easy target. And so bullying was a big deal. I'm sure it still is. And I had to deal with that. And a lot of other people did too. I wasn't the only one. But that carried on for some time. I went to high school. I went to John F. Ross for 1 year. And then I made a decision that I had to make a change. I had to make a significant change if I was going to somehow get through school without going insane because of bullying and relationships that had followed me from all the other schools I'd went right up to that point. So I made this choice. I decided to go to Guelph Collegiate Vocational Institute down in the core of Guelph. I was living closer to the edge of Guelph on Victoria and Woodlawn roads at the time, and it was huge for me. Whole new group of people. Nobody knew who I was, and I could be who I was. And they were older. By this point, I was going into grade 10, and so people, while bullying would still exist as you got older, it just kind of faded away. There were other things that were more important for people. So I could just do my thing. And it showed. My grades improved substantially. I started enjoying school in a way I'd never enjoyed before. I went to my grandparents' apartment for lunch every single day. So that was great for my relationship with my grandmother and my grandfather. And generally I would take the bus or I would bike to school. And I really enjoyed it. It's an old school, an old brick and concrete kind of a structure. In fact, it's older than Morden, where I live now. The school this year celebrates its 167th birthday. It's older than the province of Manitoba, which is pretty cool. And it had been there for quite some time. A lot of history. I can remember going up and down the steps, and the steps were a kind of a poured stone, and they had grooves, deep grooves in every step, from generations of students going up and down those stairs for over 100 years. So I have great memories of that school, mostly just because people were kind, or at least indifferent. I didn't have to deal with some of the crap that I had to deal with, growing up. I think it was I started writing when I was about 14 or 15 years old, just poetry, small poems. And it was in GCVI, where I was in high school, where I really began to take an interest in it. Took a creative writing course, won a Lions Club award for writing, and it stuck. And it occurred to me that reading and writing were really my passions. And so when high school suddenly was coming close to an end, and I began to be confronted with the reality of what my future was going to hold, I had no idea. I never knew what I wanted to be growing up. I think when I was very small, I wanted to be an astronaut for quite a number of years, until an unhelpful guidance counselor in middle school told me to aim lower. Those were his exact words, because my marks in math weren't great. So instantly, because that adult authority in my life said that, I gave up on that dream, and didn't. From that point on, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. Not astronaut, astronomer. And so here I am with the rest of my life confronting me, the end of high school. Don't know what I want to do. Knew I was passionate about reading and writing, so I decided to apply for university and declare my major right out of the gate to be an English major, and ended up going to Carleton University in Ottawa. Fantastic school, loved it. Really opened me up to I think it began my growth path in terms of maturity and developing critical thinking skills. I had to get grants. There was just no way, grants and loans. There's no way my family could afford assisting with school in any way. So grants, loans, part-time jobs, those sorts of things, paid for school. Met great friends there, exposed me to enormous variety of cultures and musics, the music scene, and courses. When you're taking a liberal arts degree, you can take practically anything you want. So there's a wide variety of courses through philosophy and literary criticism and history, and it was just a phenomenal 4-year experience for me. Prior to that, I should mention, when I was, I'd always enjoyed structured, organized groups, and I think it's because I lacked so much structure in my life. So I was a Cub Scout briefly. I had been a Boy Scout for a number of years, almost achieved the Prince of Wales award, got virtually every badge you could get, and my gold chain. It was a great experience for me, and I did some boxing when I was younger. That was fun back when when the audience could still smoke in the arena, and so by the end of the match you couldn't even freaking breathe, and you're the boxer. You felt like you were smoking as much as anybody else in the area. So that was a good experience for me. Aside from all that smoke in the ring. I was also a member of the Royal Canadian Artillery, the 11th Field Regiment in Guelph, which was founded initially to, quote, fend off Fenian raiders from the United States. These would be Irish recruits, basically recruited during the War of 1812 between Canada, or British North America, and the U.S., and then a constant worry for decades after that. So I don't think Guelph ever was at any real risk of being attacked. But be that as it is, it was founded by Colonel John McCrae, who was the father of Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, who you would know as the author of In Flanders Fields, who was also a member of the regiment briefly. So it's a really cool historical regiment to be a part of, with an amazing armory, and some great guys. And I had a good experience being a member of the reserves for a little over 3 years, almost 4. I transferred to a regiment in Ottawa when I started going to university, but I couldn't keep up regimental requirements and school requirements, so I stepped out, honorably discharged. And that was a good experience. Between Scouts and the militia, or the reserves, I was also in Air Cadets, managed to get to rank of Warrant Officer Second Class. And again, just a great structured place for me to feel like I could, it was safe. I could connect with people as best I could. And it was a thoroughly enjoyable experience for me. Then when university finished, as it does, and I still didn't know what I wanted to be, but I had met with a number of my good close friends like Brennan, Nancy, and others were journalism students at Carleton University. And of course, I'd always enjoyed writing and continued to enjoy it through university. I went on to get my college diploma in print journalism at Algonquin College. And that was great. Practical degree, gave me skills to be employed. Was able to work at the Ottawa Citizen as a stringer, covering political stories. Was able to cover Canada's first mortality in the Bosnian conflict. And was able to cover the National Capital Region's first female firefighter. I had some amazing stories. The building of a mosque in Orleans, and just the list goes on. A little investigative reporting on a automotive component, a feature on the Byword market. Yeah, it was a great experience working at the Citizen, covering those kinds of things. And I also worked for a weekly newspaper, the Orleans Star, and Hunt Club News was another paper, part of the same group. So those were experiences that I got, just my early experiences that kind of helped shape who I am. A little bit about what you're getting. That's a very rough draft, kind of glossed over perspective, but it maybe just to give you a bit of a sense of where I came from, and the journey from there to here is filled with much more narrative, but we don't need to go into that right now. At the beginning of this episode, you heard a new jingle. I want to make sure I thank Flo Lasnik, a good friend, who volunteered to create that cool jingle, which kind of encapsulates sort of the feel I wanted for this. And kudos to him for his skills. I greatly appreciate it. And look for more from Flo in the future, because I think you're going to be hearing his name a whole lot more in our community. And thanks to him. Thank you. This has been a broadcast of the Emergency Podcast System. Now return you to your regularly scheduled programming.